Okay, so I'm going to review how we multiply square roots. It's actually pretty simple. If we're going to take this first example, the square root of 2 times the square root of 5, all you have to do is multiply the two numbers and then keep them underneath the square root. So 2 times 5 is 10. So this would simplify to the square root of 10. Then, of course, you have to check the square root of 10 to make sure that it's simplified using the rule that we talked about yesterday, but there's no perfect square besides one that goes into 10, so that's my final answer. So I can do the same for this next one, square root of 2 times square root of 2. Well, that's the square root of 2 times 2, which is 4, and the square root of 4 is just 2. Also, when you have a problem similar to this one where we have the square root of some number times itself, or in other words, we're squaring a square root, squaring just undoes the square root. So really, square root of 2 times square root of 2 is just 2. So you don't even necessarily have to do that step there where we multiply the 2 times 2 and get 4 and then take the square root of it. You just know that the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is 2. So if I had the square root of 7 times the square root of 7, I know that that's just 7. The square root of 100 times the square root of 100, that's 100. You get the idea. So next problem, square root of 2 times the square root of 16. Well, before I go ahead and multiply those, you really always should check to make sure that the square roots can't be simplified. And I'm seeing 16 is a perfect square. So I'm going to leave the square root of 2 for a moment, and I'm going to simplify the square root of 16, which I know is 4. Now, generally when we have a number that's not underneath the square root, we usually put that out front of the square root. So I'm going to rewrite that, rearranging the order so that 4 root 2 is my simplified answer. And there's nothing else to simplify there, so 4 root 2 is my final answer. Next, root 6 and root 2. Neither of those can be simplified, so I'm going to go ahead and multiply. So that gives me the square root of 12. But I'm not going to stop there because I'm noticing square root of 12 can be simplified. So using the rules that we talked about before, I'm going to find the highest perfect square that goes into 12, and that's 4. So square root of 4 times the square root of 3, because 4 times 3 is 12, and the square root of 4 is 2, so 2 square root 3 is the final answer. Last one right here, 3 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 8. Well, once again, I'm going to simplify that square root of 8 before I do anything else, so I'm just going to copy the 3 root 2, and the square root of 8 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. Next, I'm going to copy the 3 root 2, and then the square root of 4 is 2, and then I keep the root 2. So I have 3 times root 2 times 2 times root 2. I'm going to go ahead and multiply the 3 and the 2 that are on the outside of the square root, which is 6. And then I'm going to do root 2 times root 2. Well, root 2 times root 2 we did before. That's root 4 or just 2. So I have 6 out front times 2 from the square root of 2 times the square root of 2. And 6 times 2 is 12. Next, let's take a look at dividing square roots. So dividing square roots, we're first going to rewrite as the square root of 12 divided by 3. I'm allowed to do that. It's just really the opposite of what we just did when we multiplied. So I have the square root of 12 divided by the square root of 3. That's the same thing as the square root of 12 divided by 3. Well, 12 divided by 3 is 4, and the square root's still over it, and the square root of 4 is 2. So I'm going to do the same thing on this one. So I have the square root of 8 over 32. Well, that needs to be simplified further, but what I'm going to do to simplify that is I'm going to simplify 8 over 32. Well, 8 over 32, 8/32, simplifies to 1/4 because 8 times 4 is 32. So I divide both numerator and denominator by 8 and I get 1 and 4. So now I can simplify square root of 1/4. And the way that I do that is by simplifying the square root of 1 divided by the square root of 4. So that the square root of 1 is 1 and the square root of 4 is 2. So the square root of 8 divided by the square root of 32 simplifies to 1/2. Next, square root of 6 divided by square root of 8. Well, that's the square root of 6/8. 6/8, I'm noticing I can divide each of those numbers by 2. So 6/8 simplifies to 3/4. Well, the square root of 3 can't be simplified, so I'll just keep it as the square root of 3, and I'll keep it as the square root of 4 for a moment, and then the square root of 3, and the square root of 4 is 2. So the square root of 3/2. Next one. So I see 3/3. Well, those factor out right away, and I'm left with 1s. So then I have the square root of 24 over the square root of 12. Well, that simplifies to the square root of 24/12. And 24 divided by 12 is 2. So that just simplifies to the square root of 2.